Hey Genderqueer Chat, happy Tuesday, it's Matt, and this week's topic is, do you think trans and genderqueer people should be lumped into the LGBTQ acronym? Have you found that your interactions explaining your gender identity with other people under the LGBTQ umbrella have been positive or negative, and do you feel more understood by them in general rather than straight individuals? So this is a really interesting question. I put a little bit of thought into it, and thinking how I might have answered this maybe a year or two ago when I was first sort of becoming more involved in the LGBT community and sort of coming out more about my identity and what I thought that community stood for and represented, and what I thought that community could offer me as a genderqueer person or a trans person, and how I fit into that rather than straight society, which I've always felt a kind of dubious connection with. So yeah, and how I feel about that now. So the LGBT community is great in the sense that in theory it's a unifying body organisation that brings together all these diverse sexual and gender related identities, brings them into one place, and in theory fights for and stands up for rights and common issues that affect people who may have one of those identities. It's also a great way of bringing these identities, which aren't necessarily mainstream and aren't necessarily the norm, into broader societal visibility and community, and taking away the scariness of homosexuals and taking away the scariness of gender freaky people. So in that sense, the LGBT community is fantastic, and I'm happy to be a part of it, happy to call myself a part of it. I've had some really interesting and fun experiences with that. In relation to my gender identity and my experiences with explaining or talking about my gender identity with people from that community, I guess that's where the shortcomings of the LGBT community alphabet soup tends to come out. I wouldn't necessarily say that my experiences in expressing and talking about my gender identity or explaining it to people who are LGBTQ people themselves has necessarily been more positive or negative than if I had been explaining it to straight people. I think originally when I first started to come out with my identity and started to link that in with the LGBTQ community, I really started thinking about gender and my gender and even transgender without even realising that it had anything to do with this LGBTQ thing. Like, I personally did not feel any kind of connection, or I didn't think what I was experiencing or gender really had anything to do with that. But once I did put that together and realised that there was a T in LGBT, then I started to realise that maybe there's a place for me and how I express myself. And that's very much true. But yeah, coming out to people and talking to people and going to queer and LGBTQ events, like, I don't feel like my identity, my genderqueer identity, is any more visible or understood than in normal straight community. I think it's probably more accepted. And it's not as if I flaunt my identity. It's something that not somebody's necessarily going to guess unless I'm talking to them actively about it. But when I do choose to actively talk to them about it, I feel like it's more understood, maybe questioned in a more intelligent way, and not understood but more accepted, and maybe questioned a bit more in an intelligent way. But yeah, definitely I wouldn't say it was understood. Like, I don't think many people in the LGBTQ community that I've come across really have much more of an idea of non-binary genders or genderqueer or even transgender than most people in the straight community. That's sort of the shortcoming maybe of the LGBT community. It has these letters in there like the T and the Q, but really the focus is the G and the L. And I don't really know if the LGBT community, which in theory fights for all of the people under that umbrella, I don't know if some of the issues that the G and the L, and to a lesser extent the B, deal with and find important are necessarily that relevant to people with a T or a Q. I think the trans people and genderqueer people and other gender variant people have their own individual issues and things that need to be defended and stood up for and made aware and brought into the public. And and I think the LGBT community is very focused on things like marriage equality and that sort of stuff. I don't know whether that's necessarily something that carries through on the rest of the letters in the acronym. I think there's also maybe a focus on the sexuality side of things. I mean, you have your lesbian, gay, bisexual, and then you've got your other letters. So the implication there is this acronym's about sexuality. And as gender diverse people, we know, even though I contested myself on several occasions, that gender identity and sexuality are two separate things and not to be confused. And so sort of lumping in the T and the Q with this acronym with the L, G, L and G and B instantly sort of gives it that edge of we're talking about sexuality. I think a lot of people who may be gender diverse do struggle with that when explaining to people, because people will assume that means that they're gay or it's something to do with sexuality or sex or in a more narrow-minded way, deviance or that sort of thing. So I don't know if the LGBT community is really a true representation of what people need and what people are looking for and what people need to be upheld who may be may have different gender identities. And so I have found personally that talking to people, they haven't necessarily understood more accepting, and I felt that, it doesn't matter who I am, or even if people know who I am or how I feel, when I go into queer spaces and LGBTQ events or spaces or groups, I feel accepted. I feel like I kind of belong there, and it feels all nice and lovely and warm and happy, which is not how I feel in straight spaces and normal heteronormative events and culture. So that's a really positive thing. But yeah, I don't think that anyone really knows any more about who I am or what my identity means than straight people. And so that's maybe a little bit frustrating. Should we be lumped under in the acronym with everyone else? I think it's useful because we're talking about identities that are a minority, and it's probably better to have safety in numbers and a bigger force. So if you do chuck in your T's and your Q's and your I's and every other letter in with your bigger L and G and B, then you've got a bigger force, a bigger community, a bigger awareness, a bigger visibility, and that's got to be important when trying to pass things like legislation or just having more acceptance by the community. So it may not be a true representation or necessarily be fighting for the same causes as a person more focused on gender would be, but at least it's something. However, I think I talked about this in another video quite early on that I came across, and I came across something that has been promoted in Australia through an organisation, I think, new acronym, which is ISGD, which stands for intersex, sex and or gender diverse. And I really like this one because it does take that focus away from sexuality. It takes the focus away from gay and lesbian, and it establishes maybe a new hierarchy or a new way of thinking about it, and I think would probably encompass a whole spectrum of sexualities and gender diversities in an acronym that may be a little more useful and maybe a little bit more updated and relevant, perhaps. So yeah, intersex, sex and or gender diverse. I really like that myself. I don't say I use it necessarily, but I don't really use LGBTQ either. But I think that's really cool, and it'd be great if it caught on, because yeah, I mean, intersex is a different thing, and gender diversity is a different thing to sexuality, and these things kind of need maybe their own space and their own place and their own focus. And yeah, so I think the LGBTQ acronym is great, and I think we belong, and strength in numbers and all that stuff, but also look at how they may be limiting for people who are gender diverse, trans and genderqueer people, and so maybe we do need another acronym for that. I hope that's answered the question. I feel like I've gone off track a bit, but yeah, my experiences have been positive, and whether or not I feel like LGBTQ people understand me or accept me more is sort of up for debate, but I certainly appreciate having those spaces and having access to that community, and I don't know if I would have quite grown into my gender identity quite as easily if I hadn't have had access to that community. So I think it's good, but it's worthwhile, like everything, understanding that everything has its limitations and things can be changed and things sometimes get outdated, and it doesn't hurt to look at things with that sort of perspective and challenge it. So cool. Anyway, thanks for listening, and yeah, I'll see you next week.